Well, bonjour à tous. Hello, everyone. Just wanted to start my talk with a short message of support for my colleagues in UK universities and at Queen's, who are currently striking for fair pay, fair pension, against zero-hour contracts and precarity, because I would have liked to join them, but instead of I'm here, which obviously it means a lot to me as well. But if you don't know about this strike, please look it up, because international support means a lot to them as well. So my presentation is titled Threshold Spaces, the Unexpected Link Between Interior Paintings and Art Nouveau Architecture. I'm actually very glad Françoise Aubry did her talk and introduction about broader concerns about interiors in Art Nouveau and including paintings as well, because I'm going to look at some of those issues as well in my presentation. In particular, I will make the case for exploring the connections between threshold spaces in architecture and in paintings, through, like I said, their shared concern for this transition space, the threshold spaces. So the 19th century has been described by many scholars as a society that relied heavily on categorization, on a separation of spheres. And what they mean by that is that you have, on one hand, a private sphere, which is associated with women, the domestic, houses, and things like that. And on the other hand, you have the public sphere, which is associated with men, work, all the important stuff. And obviously, so this private and public sphere coinciding with gender, class, and economic boundaries. Victoria Rosner has shown how threshold spaces can be difficult to deal with in this economy of private sphere, because there are these transition spaces. And she writes that a way of life built around separation and specialization encounters difficulty when faced with transitional or in-between states that resist categorization. And such states are architecturally embodied in the threshold, the space that forms a bridge between two discrete rooms. So in the same way that society assigned roles to people, it assigned roles to rooms and different spaces. So it shows the relevance of studying the threshold as an architecturally, but also as a socially and symbolically significant space. And especially when it is undergoing changes, as it is the case with Art Nouveau architecture. So spaces like corridors, doors, smaller rooms appeared in the 18th century. I mean, that's a bit of a overgeneralization, but to simplify, many of these spaces appeared in the 18th century to enhance intimacy. But what we see at the end of the 19th century is that there is a progressive removal and blurring of spatial boundaries within the homes, and it is especially the case with Art Nouveau architecture, at least part of the architects within that style. And they begin to experiment with removing walls and opening up spaces inside the home. And they were doing this because they were focusing a lot on the linking and the fluidity of space. So the transition between reception rooms were mediated by things like glass doors, stairs, or curtains, shelves, anything like that. And Vincent Aymans, who has written a book about bourgeois domestic architecture in the end of the 19th century in Belgium, has written that la faiblesse de la maison bourgeoise classique réside dans son manque chronique d'ambiance. Les lumières, les couleurs, les enchaînements de perception restent souvent médiocres. Par contre, l'Art Nouveau tend vers un aboutissement et une unification des expressions spatiales. So what he highlights here is the unification process that merged different spaces together in Art Nouveau architecture. And we see that at the same time, in paintings, these threshold spaces are becoming increasingly important as well, as a lot of artists are focusing on depicting doors, windows, or are framing their image in such a way that several rooms are represented in the same painting. What you might ask yourself at this point is that, is it possible or is it even relevant to study in a comparative way the threshold spaces in architecture and in painting? Well, that's a very good question. And Vincent Aymans, in the same book, and I believe I've seen that maybe he's in the room, so sorry about that, has argued that interior paintings cannot be used as a reliable way to study interiors and architecture, because they would only reflect the creativity of the painter. And recent research has also shown that symbolism and Art Nouveau, who would be two of the most important artistic movements at the time, would be unrelated to each other because there are no or hardly any traces of direct collaboration. Well, it's true that there are a few paintings that are directly representing existing interior, at least in Belgium. We've seen an example with the presentation of Françoise Aubry in the house of Karl Hoffmann, I believe. In that case, you have a painting that directly represents an existing interior. But even when this is not the case, there are subtler links between interiors in architecture and interiors in painting. And I'm going to first point to three main ones. There has been an important book called The Emergence of the Interior, written by Charles Rice, was a book important in the field of interior studies, and he has pointed towards the doubleness of interiors meanings, because it exists both as a spatial reality and as an image. And he writes, the interior emerged with significance as a physical, three-dimensional space, as well as an image. Significantly, doubleness involves the interdependence between image and space, with neither sense being primary. And indeed, if you look at historical French dictionaries, you see that the definition of intérieur as the interiors of one's home appeared in 1798, but then as early as 1835, interior as both the meaning of the interior of a house, the domestic life, but also its representation, and mostly, especially in painting. So significantly for my argument, Art Nouveau architecture is an architecture that is best, or at least that would be my perception, is best apprehended through the sense of vision, because there is an emphasis on light, there is an emphasis on colors, there is an emphasis on opening up spaces and perspective. So they share actually these visual qualities with paintings. Secondly, a lot of major artists in the end of the 19th century were involved with the interior. You can think, for example, of James Ensor, Fernand Knopf, Georges Lebrun. They were all either designing their own house or developing a collection or decorating their interior. And so they did not use their domestic environment as a simple backdrop for their paintings, but they were actually fashioning their own interior. And in that sense, for these artists, there was a coming and going between the images they produced and the interiors they were inhabiting and fashioning for themselves. And this fact highlights the closeness between interior and image that I have underlined, and that the book of Charles Rice has underlined as well. Finally, many architects and painters articulate their reflection around interior spaces with questions about fluidity and the challenges of boundaries and the challenges of traditional roles of different spaces. And here I have two images. One is of the Horta house, built by the architect Victor Horta. And then the other image is a painting by Theo van Rysselbergh, a portrait of François van Rysselbergh's children. And there is a useful comparison to draw here between these two images, and I will go through it with you. So here in the picture of the Horta house, we have a view from the salon into the dining room. And we see that all the spaces are visually interconnected. So if you're sitting in the salon, you can have access to the dining room, at least visually. And here on this painting, you can see that you have all the children on the foreground. But then if you look at this very bizarre thing in the background where you have a space with several doors open that actually don't really lead somewhere. But you have the same idea of being into one space and having visually access to another space. And both many architects and many painters at the time took care of opening up perspectives, of visually giving access to different spaces. They introduced distance in this way. But as you can see, this unfolding of space, particularly in the painting, is quite ambiguous because it doesn't lead to you to somewhere you can identify or you can see precisely. And at this stage, it's useful to know that Art Nouveau architecture, however revolutionary it may be considered, retained a lot of the separations and a lot of the categorizations that were in use in traditional bourgeois house. And because it has no bearing walls, technically, it could have no distinctions between rooms at all. But to some extent, it does retain them. And you can see, if you have visited the Horta house, you can see as well that the layout of the house remained very faithful to class distinctions because there is no way that the servant quarters could interact with the main part of the house. So the spatial boundaries are still there, they're just displaced further, they're moved towards the edge. And so in the Horta house, this ability of moving freely through space would be only the privilege of a very few people. So we'll now examine two cases of threshold spaces, stairs and curtains, to see to which extent spatial boundaries were not only displaced, as I've just explained, but also challenged in certain contexts. So in the Horta house, sorry if I just come back to this image for a bit, you have the main staircase. You only see it. You only see a very small part of it, but it's directly connected to the main living spaces. So it's not, hidden in a corridor or hidden in a hallway, which would be very typical of some Art Nouveau architecture. So what we can see about transition space and threshold spaces in Art Nouveau is that this very fact that they try to render them seamless also highlights them and give them a central position and a central importance in the house. And in this painting, which is The Children of Mr. Neve by Fernand Knopf, we see, if you compare it to the portrait that we've seen just before, we see that here the children literally inhabit the threshold space. So they are not, on the previous image, they were on the foreground. No, they are on the stairs. The stairs would not typically be a place where you go by, but you don't typically stand on or linger in or those sorts of things. And here it's used in a rather theatrical way as a device to portray the children. But although there is There is what seems to be an open door on the top. We cannot see what lies behind. We have no access, obviously, to what is below either. So the focus is on the threshold itself. And in the same way that the house of Horta renders ambiguous the function and the use of its main staircase. Is it a functional element? Is it a decorative element? Is it part of the room, or is it outside of it? This painting also transforms the staircase in a space worth looking at and worth portraying. So we'll now look at another painting of the symbolist painter Fernand Knopf, and we'll talk about curtains. So curtains were starting to be used around the turn of the century as a way to rethink the separations between different rooms in architecture, not only in Art Nouveau architecture, but partly in Art Nouveau architecture. And here, with this portrait of Marie Monon by Fernand Knopf, we see that in the background there is a blue curtain hanging behind her. Okay. But the background is actually quite, as it is often the case with Knopf anyway, it's quite unclear to understand exactly what does it mean, or what does it mean in terms of spatial configuration, because there is this curtain and then there is a lock, so it might be a door behind, and then there is a wood pin on that side, which might be another door, but we're not sure. So the sitter here is portrayed in a very unusual space, because it seems quite unusual that you would be in front of two doors to have your portrait made. And the curtains here, in comparison to a door, retains the possibility of uncovering what lay behind. It has the idea of mobility that is, well, inherent to them. And writing about the portrait of Jeanne Keffer, Michel Draguet has underlined the importance of the architectural framework and the theatralization of the image in Knopf's portrait. It proved true several years later when Knopf gave an architectural shape to the images he created. Actually, some spaces inside the home he designed with the architect Edmond Pelzener in 1902 are very reminiscent of images that he painted several years before that. And there, as you can see, blue curtains were introduced as room dividers, and they were part of what has been described as a very as a stage environment and as a very theatrical experience, in the sense that the visitors authorized in the villa related the very strict journey they had to go through to be able to be allowed to see the different spaces of the home, and they were at some point stopped by Knopf's butler so that the painter could take a very staged position before they were allowed to see him in his studio, etc. But Knopf was actually not the only one to use curtains in a domestic environment as a room divider at the time. The Austrian and Czech architect Adolf Loos, for example, would do it as well in his home in 1903, although probably those were amongst the first examples. They were also used in Art Nouveau architecture, and in Belgium it is the case, for example, with Serrurier Bovy, and you have here an exterior view of the villa he designed for himself, L'Aube, but also a view of the salon and the dining room inside the home, and where you can see those curtains there. I believe Françoise Aubry had a picture where they were closed. No, they are open. And you can see that they act as a framing and theatrical device, something that enhance the visual qualities of what you can see, what you can peek through, what you can see behind, in this case, through their opening. And in the castle of La Chérelle, who was not built by Serrurier-Bovy, but which interior design was done by Serrurier-Bovy and René Dulong between 1903 and 1901, the use of curtains allow an even more radical redefinition of interior space, because all the traditional spaces of the dining room, sitting room, smoking room, etc., have been fused into one big space, the living room, and curtains are used to delineate some subsections that are allocated to certain functions. But you might wonder why curtains and not doors, and why is that even relevant as a difference between the two? Well, like I said, they introduced the idea of movement, they introduced the idea of fluidity, they introduced the idea of theatricality, and they play a role in dismantling spatial boundaries by replacing doors with a mobile fabric that can be open, closed, or anything in between, really. So ultimately, thinking about transitions in architecture would lead to erase them. Think about open plan design, for example. But actually, there is a world of possibilities between, fixed spatial boundaries and their complete erasure. So architects and painters have experimented with several options, and by subverting the expecting function of a space, and by juxtaposing different rooms, interior paintings rendered the spaces they depicted more fluid, more ambivalent, and that was echoed by changes in architecture and interior design. And in both cases, you can see that rooms were not thought anymore as isolated units, but in the way they related to each other. And these relationships could be managed with devices like glass doors, like curtains, like doors, like stairs, etc. And these devices indicate the need of reaching a careful balance, that is, distinguishing between rooms, but so linking different spaces, but still distinguishing between them. And the examples that I have covered demonstrate that there is a general movement towards flexibility, rendering spaces more ambivalent, giving them more functions. We can think of other examples, for example, the folding screens that architect Paul Ancard designed for interiors of restaurants, which allow for an ever-changing reconfiguration of interior spaces. Or you can think as well of the furniture Henri van de Velde or Serrurier-Bovy designed at the time, which combined different use in one piece of furniture, for example, benches with integrated bookcase, or coat hangers with mirrors, that sort of things. And they combined several use and in one piece of furniture, and so they call for another definition of the space around them. So what I hope to have shown you is that there is a reflection around space in interiors, around the question of fluidity, flexibility, and that can be seen through examining threshold spaces, both in architecture and interior paintings at the time. Thank you.